The frost came early that year, seeping into bones before sunup, cracking water pails like brittle glass and biting the skin of every soul left working the black hollow pit. Somewhere between the coal soot and the sunrise, a girl moved with the quiet precision of someone who'd forgotten how to be anything else. She was small for 12, all elbow and ankle, her hair the dull brown of river mud and matted by weeks of ash. Her dress had once been yellow. Now it was more gray than anything, ragged at the hem, patched at the knees, the sort of fabric that whispered its own grief when it moved. Eliza hauled the bucket again, breath steaming like smoke, arms trembling. She didn't speak as she worked. Most assumed she couldn't. But she could. Her voice was tucked deep, far beneath the silence she wore like armor. The miners didn't bother with her name. They called her the brat, the mule, sometimes worse. She responded to none of it. Only the slap of her bare feet on packed dirt, only the creak of the pulley, only the grit of her shadow against snow, ever marked her presence. The man who claimed to be her father hadn't spoken to her since the night he lost the deed to her body in a backroom card game. That was 3 months past. Since then, Eliza had slept behind the stove of the cook shack, under a greasy burlap sack, curled around a carved wooden figure so worn the shape of it could only be guessed. Her mother had whittled it once, years ago, humming a song in Lakota that Eliza hadn't heard since the fever took her. She didn't cry. Crying made things harder. A bell rang. Morning meal, black coffee, and dry biscuit if she was lucky. A cuff to the ear if she wasn't. She didn't go. Not yet. The bucket needed filling. The old miner's wife, Mrs. Gillens, had fallen ill last night. Someone needed to fetch the wash water. No one else had volunteered. No one ever did. From the ridge above the camp, a man watched. He didn't move much. Just sat his horse beneath a bare cottonwood, its branches shivering like bones against sky. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He wore a thick wool coat, worn but clean, and a long braid fell over one shoulder like a black ribbon tied by time itself. A Lakota warrior. He'd been watching for near a week, coming in close, pulling back, always at dawn, never speaking. Most of the miners hadn't noticed him. Those who had muttered about trouble, about scalping and savages and vengeance. But nothing came of it. He did nothing, said nothing, until that morning. The girl stumbled. The bucket splashed her legs with cold. She gasped softly and froze. Her shoulders tightened, not from the chill, but the sudden, awful dread that someone had seen. They had. The man at the ridge nudged his horse forward. Down he came, silent as dusk, no saddle creaking, no stomp of hooves, just a slow approach, measured and sure. When he reached the camp, nobody stopped him. Not the foreman, not the drunk cook. He walked straight past the shovel piles and steam vents to the cook shack door. Inside, a few men played cards. One snorted at the sight of him. Well, hell, the wild's come calling. The Lakota man didn't answer. He laid 2 silver coins on the table, slow and clear, and then spoke, low and calm. She's done here. The room stilled. Chair leg scraped. A laugh cracked the air, followed by a spit to the floor. She's property, Redskin. Ain't yours to take. He didn't argue, just looked. Not with threat, not even anger, just something deeper. Like he was measuring what parts of their souls might still be salvageable. The cook was the one who moved first. He scooped up the coins, grunted, and turned his back. Girl's yours if you're stupid enough to want her. Eliza stood outside the doorway, clutching her wooden carving, unsure if she'd imagined it all. The Lakota man emerged. He met her eyes without bending down, didn't smile, didn't beckon, just nodded once and turned. She followed. No one stopped them. The walk out of camp took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like crossing a whole country. Eliza didn't speak. Neither did he. Snow began to fall in small, drifting flecks, soft as cotton lint. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and something older, sage, maybe, or the bitter bite of memory. He didn't ask where she came from. She didn't ask where they were going. The cabin sat in a clearing 2 miles south, tucked between 2 old birches and built from hand-hewn logs weathered silver by wind and sun. A small lean-to housed a horse. Smoke curled from the chimney in lazy rings. It looked like it had always been there, like it had been waiting. Inside, the walls were bare but clean. A cot by the fire, a stone hearth, a basket of dried roots. No pictures, no clocks, only stillness, warm and heavy. He gestured for her to sit. She did, near the fire. He handed her a blanket, then turned his back, giving her privacy. She didn't expect that. No one had ever given her privacy before. Later, he made stew, venison and corn and wild onion. She watched him stir it, his hand steady, his gaze distant. She wondered who he'd been before. Not out loud, just in the way children do, silently, deeply. When he handed her the bowl, she whispered thanks. He only nodded. The flames danced at her eyes as she ate, one spoon at a time, slowly, as if rushing might undo the whole spell. When her belly was full and the light had gone soft and gold across the walls, she reached into her pocket and held out the carving. A woman's figure, weathered smooth. He looked at it, then at her. She whispered a line, something in Lakota, an old lullaby. He looked at her differently then, not surprised, not startled, just seeing her, fully. He placed a small feather on the windowsill and said, gently, in his tongue, Midikui Oyaze. All my relations. She didn't understand the words, not really, but she felt them in her bones. That night, for the first time in years, Eliza didn't dream of soot or fire or fists. She dreamed of wide rivers and carved hills, of a woman singing by firelight, and of a man who said nothing but saw everything. And in the morning, when she woke to the scent of pine and stew and wood smoke, she didn't run. She stayed. The sun barely reached over the hills when Eliza stirred beneath the fir throw, her breath fogging in the still cabin air. The fire had gone low in the night, leaving only orange embers tucked beneath gray ash. She sat up slowly, unsure if the peace she'd found the day before would still hold when the world resumed its spinning. Her feet touched the wooden floor, rough but warm. The blanket slid from her shoulders like the last touch of a dream. The man, Wakasa, she had heard him called once in the pit, was already moving about, noiseless in the way snow falls. He stirred the fire without waking it fully, placed more wood gently than most men handle glass, then stepped outside without a word. She watched from the window as he moved through the trees, not like a ghost, but something even quieter. His every gesture seemed carved by purpose, shaped by a grief so old it no longer needed name or excuse. His coat shifted around his knees. The wind lifted the end of his braid. Eliza held her carved figure tight in one hand and breathed through the memory of all the men she'd known, shouting, demanding, striking, always needing something he didn't need. That alone disarmed her more than kindness ever could. He returned with a rabbit strung over one shoulder and snowflakes in his hair. Without a glance, he set about cleaning it outside on a flat rock, hands quick and respectful. There was no waste, no rush, just the way things had to be done. Eliza stepped outside when she saw him lighting the outdoor fire. She didn't ask permission. She just sat on a log nearby and waited. He looked up once. "You ever skinned one?" he asked, voice low, thick with an accent more shaped by nature than any tongue. She shook her head. He handed her the small knife, handle first, blade resting in his palm like a trust offering. She looked at it, then at him. He didn't urge, just nodded. Her hands trembled at first, not from fear, from the strange intimacy of being given something to do that mattered. Together they worked. The morning passed in the hush of shared task. When the meat was hung to smoke and the fur set aside, Wakasa pulled a small clay bowl from the shelf and filled it with berries soaked in honeyed snow. He passed it to her with a wooden spoon. She ate slowly. It tasted like something forbidden. He watched her a moment. "You speak Lakota?" She paused mid-spoon, then nodded. "My mother," she whispered. She did. He looked down, brushed a bit of snow from his knee. "Your name?" he asked softly. "Eliza." He repeated it once under his breath, trying it out like a prayer, then said nothing more. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It simply was. Later, she helped him stack firewood along the back wall, his axe steady, hers small, but swinging with growing confidence. Her dress snagged on the bark. He gave her a leather coat from a chest, much too large, but warm. She wore it like armor. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was pretending to be someone else's shadow. When evening crept across the snow, casting long blue fingers through the trees, he showed her how to snare rabbits and twist cord from yucca fibers. She watched his hands, broad, rough, scar-laced but careful, like every movement mattered. That night, she sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, carving a small new figure beside her mother's old one. This one had his braid. He noticed, didn't comment, just stirred the stew, and placed 2 bowls on the floor between them. Something warm unfolded in the space between them. Not love, not yet, but something deeper than comfort. A wordless understanding that required no explaining. On the 3rd morning, he took her into the valley. Not far, just down to the stream where the fish still moved beneath the ice. She marveled at the quiet beauty of the place, the way the wind spoke through the cottonwoods, how the light turned silver on snow. She crouched and touched the ice. "It's clear," she whispered. He nodded. "Like truth," he said. "Hard to hold, but beautiful when you see it." She looked up at him. His face was lined but not old, tired but not broken. His eyes, so unreadable from afar, were gentle up close. They didn't stare. They saw. "I thought you'd ask where I came from," she said. "I see where you are now," he answered. And that was enough. Each day after that became its own little story. She learned to bind arrow fletchings, to cook maize cakes on hot stones, to listen for the way birds warned of others coming. He let her find her rhythm, never corrected with harshness, never filled silence with noise. But not all moments were soft. On the 7th day, a rider passed on the ridgeline. Not close, not lingering, but Eliza saw him. So did Wakasa. Neither spoke of it that evening, though his bow was oiled and laid beside the door. Still, the peace returned, as if the world, even in its cruelty, had offered them a small, sacred space of reprieve. One night, as the wind howled like wolves above the chimney, she spoke again, voice no louder than a breath. "Why did you take me?" He didn't look up from the knife he was sharpening. "Because no one else did." The answer was simple, but it hit like thunder. No promises, no grand speeches, just that. She lay awake that night beneath the woven blanket, staring at the rafters, her hand wrapped around the 2 carved figures now resting side by side. Her heart thudded slow and steady, not afraid, not uncertain, just full. She didn't know what would come next, whether the men who once used her would come looking, whether this peace could hold against a world that had always been cruel. But in the quiet cabin, with the fire warm and his footsteps steady just beyond the door, she knew one thing. For the first time since her mother's death, she wasn't alone. And sometimes that was how healing began. Not with loud declarations or sudden miracles, but with a steady presence. A man with kind eyes. A silence that didn't hurt. A bowl of stew passed without a word. And the soft, unwavering knowledge that someone had seen you and stayed. The days turned soft, like old linen warmed by sun, folding around Eliza in quiet patterns of repetition and renewal. Snow came and went, melting on the cabin's roof before it ever gathered deep, leaving the ground damp and the trees black with memory. In the little glade, life settled into stillness. Not the kind born of boredom, but the kind that makes space for breathing, for beginning again. Each morning, she woke before light, pulled on the oversized leather coat, and stepped into the clearing with bare hands. Wakasa was always up before her, already at some task, boiling herbs, fixing a split shaft, whispering something to the horses that only they understood. He never scolded, never rushed. If she slept longer, he let her. If she rose early, he handed her something to carry. She liked the way he let her be. In that cabin, there were no harsh commands, no yanked arms, no eyes that saw only fault. If she dropped a cup, he picked it up. If she cut herself on a splinter, he wrapped her hand in silence. He gave her a knife of her own, small and bone-handled, polished smooth. Not for defense, for crafting. for carving wood and shaping nettle string and peeling apples, so thin she could almost see through the skin. At night, she'd sit by the hearth with that knife and shape the stories that lived inside her, the ones that hadn't had air to breathe before. A fox, a rabbit, a woman with a bundle on her back and a hawk on her shoulder. They began to line the shelf beside the fire, forming a quiet wooden family. One afternoon, while Wakasa mended the cabin's roof, Eliza wandered toward the ridge to gather firewood. Her boots, gifts from him, too big still, sank into the loam, but she walked steady. She knew the woods now, knew which trees wept sap and which cracked loud in the wind. She found the broken branch of a sugar pine, still sticky and fragrant, and bent to pick it up when she heard the sound. Not wind, not bird, laughter, male, cruel in its lightness. She froze. Heart kicked once, hard. Then again. Through the trees, a pair of men rode low across the valley, not toward her, yet, but not far off either. She ducked behind a stump, breath locked. She listened. One voice rose, careless and sharp. "If the girl ain't back by week's end, we sell her spot to the Chinaman's boy. Easier anyway. Can't have that redskin thinking he owns what's his." Laughter again. Then hoofbeats fading. Eliza didn't move for a long while. When she did, her legs were numb and her fingers hurt from clutching bark too tightly. She ran back to the cabin, the bundle of pine forgotten, and found Wakasa seated on the porch, sharpening a chisel with that same patient calm. His eyes flicked up at her. "They're looking," she said, breath hitching. "They were on the ridge. They said I was theirs." Wakasa stood slowly. He didn't ask her to repeat it, didn't question her. He simply placed the chisel aside and reached into the small basket near the door. From it, he drew a single gray and white feather. Hawk, she thought, and walked to the windowsill. He set it there, right in the corner, just so it caught the light. "They will come," he said, "and we will not run." She didn't know how to answer that, but her heart steadied. That night, Wakasa lit a bundle of dried sweetgrass and waved the smoke through the room, whispering in Lakota. Not for magic, for memory, for peace. Later, when she curled up under the fur, the knife tucked under her pillow and the fire humming low, she whispered across the dark, "Will they hurt you?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, "They've already tried." A pause. "But they will not again." Eliza pressed her hand to the small carving of the woman with the hawk. She didn't cry, but something inside her cracked open. Not pain, not fear, something braver. A question she didn't yet know how to name. The next day, they prepared. Not by digging traps or loading guns, but by readying themselves. Wakasa took her into the thicker part of the forest, where the trees grew tangled and the snow lingered longer. He showed her how to walk without leaving tracks, how to follow animal trails, and feel the direction of the sun even through clouds. They built a blind in the rock bend, just in case. They placed jars of dried meat in its corners. He never called it hiding. "It's just knowing where to go when you need stillness," he said. She understood. They visited Widow Branley a few miles west, under the guise of trading a basket for cornmeal. The old woman, whose spine curled like an autumn leaf, gave Eliza a small blue ribbon and a kiss on the cheek. "She's watching out for you," she whispered, nodding toward the sky. Tomas, the horse tender, offered no words, just a nod, and a small sack of salt tucked silently into Wakasa's pack. By week's end, the air had shifted, not in scent or sound, but in feel. The birds flew lower. The horses stamped uneasily at night. And when Eliza sat by the fire, carving a rabbit from willow, she felt the wood splinter in her hands more than once. On the 6th morning, the feather on the windowsill was gone. No wind had come through. No draft. Just gone. Wakasa said nothing. He placed his bough near the door and fed the fire 2 more logs. At dusk, Eliza found a note nailed to the barn door. Scrawled in rust-colored ink, the words slanted and rushed. "Return the girl. She's worth gold." Beside it, a knife. Not theirs. Too polished. Too sharp. She stared at it a long time, then turned to Wakasa, who had stepped behind her silently. His voice was calm. "Are you afraid?" She nodded. But I don't want to run. He looked at her, really looked, and placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we stay. That night, the fire burned low and steady. No stories. No singing. Just breath and presence and quiet certainty. Eliza sat by the window, watching the dark swallow the trees. Her knife sat on the table beside her. Not as a weapon, as a promise. They were not what the world had called them. She was not property. He was not danger. Together, they were something the ridgeline men couldn't understand. And as the moon slid high above the forest, cold and full and indifferent, Eliza whispered to the featherless sill, "I'm not leaving. Not again." The snow began falling before dawn, thick and wet, muffling every sound like wool pulled over the ears of the world. The trees hunched under its weight. Smoke from the cabin chimney rose straight into the pale gray sky, undisturbed by wind. Inside, the fire cracked, steady and low. Eliza stirred the pot, careful with a spoon, breathing in the scent of wild onions and deer bone. Her fingers moved with practiced grace. Her shoulders no longer tense with every creak of the floorboards. Wakasa sat near the door, wrapping sinew around a shaft, shaping an arrow by feel more than sight. His bow rested on the wall behind him. A second one now hung above the hearth, shorter, strung lower, made for smaller hands. Eliza had helped carve it. She didn't ask how he knew they would come soon. She felt it in the way he watched the window longer than usual, in the way the horses grew restless at night. Even the birds had gone quiet. The knock came in the late morning. Not a rap. A slam. 3 hard fists against wood. Eliza froze. Wakasa didn't rise. He laid the half-bound arrow across his lap and reached for nothing. Just waited. A voice called out, thick with whiskey and spit. "We're here for the girl. Don't want no trouble. Just return what ain't yours." Eliza's pulse kicked once fast, then steadied. Another voice, younger, meaner. "You let her out, Red Man, and maybe we let you keep your teeth." Silence stretched. The fire crackled. A hawk cried far off. Wakasa stood. He moved to the door, opened it with calm like the sea after a storm. 3 men waited outside. Their coats were damp with snow, their faces twisted by the cold and their own smallness. The tallest held a rifle, though not aimed. Another leaned on a shovel, as if that somehow made him larger. The last, a wiry man with a scar across his chin, smiled as he spoke. "She's got value," he said. "The girl. Rare blood, so they say. Pretty enough, too. And smart. The boss back east'll pay triple what we thought. We can split it even. Or—" his gaze flicked to Eliza, who had stepped behind Wakasa, eyes dark and dry. "Or we take her anyway." Wakasa didn't speak for a long moment. Then, low and clear, "She's no one's to take." The man with the scar laughed. "Everything's for sale, Redskin. That's what makes the world turn." Wakasa stepped forward, closing the space between them. Eliza felt the breath leave her body. "No," he said, voice like stone rubbed smooth by river. "That's what makes it rot." The man with the shovel reached for something. Too fast. Wakasa's hand moved faster. Not a weapon. His palm. It landed flat against the man's chest, not hard. Just enough. The man stumbled back, slipped in the snow, and hit the ground with a grunt. The rifle didn't rise. The one holding it stared too long at Wakasa's eyes and forgot what he'd come for. The scarred man sneered, spat in the snow, and turned. "This ain't over." They left without looking back. But they would return. That night, Wakasa laid out the traps. Not to kill. To warn. Old metal jaws near the trailhead. A snare above the north bend. He showed Eliza how to rig a bell between 2 branches. How to smear crushed pine over tracks to confuse dogs. They worked side by side, swift and silent. When they returned to the cabin, the sky was purple with dusk. Eliza sat beside the window, carving. Her hands didn't shake. Wakasa warmed a stone and handed it to her for her lap. "They'll come again," she said. He nodded once. "I'm ready," she said, quieter. He looked at her then, not with pity, with pride. As if she had become something the world hadn't expected. Not just safe. Whole. 3 nights passed. No sound. No smoke. No sign. But then the barn. It burned before anyone woke. The flames swallowed it fast, angry and yellow, reaching up into the dawn like a curse shouted at God. The horses were gone. The tack, the grain, everything. Wakasa had pulled her from sleep, thrown the fur around her, and let her out just in time to see the roof collapse inward with a roar. They watched from the trees. He said nothing, just placed his hand on her back. The smoke lingered for 2 days. Eliza didn't cry, but she built a new carving that morning, in the shape of a barn, blackened and broken, with small birds flying out from under its eaves. They hid the rest of their supplies in the blind by the rock bend. Tomas passed through once, left jerky and matches in a hollow tree, never asking for thanks. Widow Branley lit a lantern in her window every evening, a signal, or a prayer. The men didn't return right away, but the storm did, heavy this time, sky the color of lead, snow thick as flour. For 3 days they were buried in white. Wakasa stacked wood high inside, and Eliza took to reading the old Lakota book he kept hidden in a box under his cot. She traced each symbol, mouthing the words. He corrected her gently. On the 4th day, the snow stopped. The world came back quieter, heavier. A stillness that came before something broke. That evening, the bell trap sang. Just once. Not a clang. Just a whisper of metal against metal. Eliza rose without needing to be told. They didn't light the lamps. Didn't speak. Wakasa handed her the small bow. Not a game. Not pretend. They waited. Then footsteps on snow. 1 pair. Then another. Then 3 more. Too many. Too loud. They moved to the back door. Slipped out. Down the trail to the hollow where the traps lay waiting. Eliza didn't run. She crouched in the snow beside Wakasa, listening to the crack of branches behind them, the crunch of boots. He whispered in Lakota, "Breathe like the trees." Still, but listening. She did. A man passed within 10 feet of them, cursing under his breath. Another laughed. Bet she's still hiding in the bedroll. Little brat. Should have tagged her ear like livestock. Eliza's fingers curled around the bowstring. Her breath turned to stone in her throat. Then another voice. Not close. A scream. One of the traps had caught a man's boot. The others scattered. Gunshots cracked the air, wild, blind. Eliza didn't flinch. Wakasa drew his own bow and loosed once, clean and silent. A groan followed. Then nothing. Snow fell again, soft, drifting over the broken prints. They waited. Long minutes passed. No more voices. Just quiet. They returned to the cabin as dawn broke. One of the men was gone. The others had vanished into the pines. The feather on the windowsill had returned, though no one had placed it. Eliza sat at the table, her knees muddy, her eyes full of snowlight. "They won't stop," she said. Wakasa poured warm water into the basin, gently wiped the dirt from her hands. "Then neither will we." She smiled. Not because it was over, because it wasn't. By morning, the barn was nothing but a black ribcage sunk into snow. Smoke drifted from its bones like breath that hadn't quite left. A few stubborn flames still licked at the broken timbers, too weak to rise, too proud to die. Eliza stood wrapped in Wakasa's coat, boots buried ankle deep, eyes on the place where the horses had once slept. She didn't speak. Her fists were clenched inside the sleeves, fingers gripping splinters she hadn't realized she'd pocketed from the night before. Wakasa crouched nearby, burying the last of the shattered tack. He moved with a kind of deliberate grace, as if even in ruin he still honored the dead. When he rose, his face was unreadable, his hands blackened with soot. "This was the warning," he said quietly. Eliza turned to him. "Then what's next?" He looked to the tree-line. Their mistake. Later that day, they rode into town, not through the back trails, not hidden by dusk, but down the main road, straight and slow. Wakasa borrowed a horse from Tomas, one broad and sure-footed. Eliza rode behind him, her hands at his waist, her spine stiff with the weight of decision. She wore the blue ribbon Widow Branley had tied into her braid, and at her side, her small bow rested in a cloth bundle. The town wasn't large, but it watched them like they were a storm in human shape. Miners leaned on shovels. Saloon girls peered through cracked windows. The sheriff stepped out of his office, hand on his belt, a question behind his eyes he didn't yet dare ask. They dismounted at the courthouse steps. Inside, it was dim, dust swirling in shafts of light. The few men who had made the claim on Eliza sat at a bench near the front, scarred, stiff, their faces shifting between smugness and unease. Wakasa stood before them, saying nothing. It was Eliza who stepped forward, the sound of her boots small but steady. "I'm not a debt," she said. The room stilled. "I'm not a thing to be sold. I was never yours. My mother was Lakota. My father gave me away, and these men," she pointed, voice shaking only at the edges, "try to burn me out of my home because they think a girl who speaks more than one tongue must be worth something in gold." One of the men laughed, short and bitter. "You are. Just not in the way you think." Wakasa's gaze met his. It was not angry. It was final. The sheriff cleared his throat. "There any proof?" Widow Branley stood at the back. "There's a carving in her mother's likeness that she's had since before the camps. And I've heard her speak both tongues. The girl knows what she's saying." Tomas stepped forward. "They burned the barn. We all saw the smoke." The sheriff looked around. No one spoke in the men's defense. Not even them. "The law says she can't be owned," he muttered, scratching at his beard. "And the law says you three need to answer for that fire." The scarred man stood up. "She ain't worth the trouble." "She never was," another added. They walked out without fight. Maybe they knew better. Or maybe they'd just lost interest when profit dried up. The courtroom emptied. Wakasa turned to leave, but the sheriff called out, "You gonna raise her?" Wakasa paused. "No." Eliza's heart skipped, then stumbled. "She's going to raise herself. I'm just going to stay near enough that she remembers she doesn't have to do it alone." They rode home slow. Spring began to show its first hints that week. The snow melted in long silver rivulets down the hills. Shoots of green pierced the earth beside the charred wreckage of the barn. Birds returned, wary at first, then bold. Wakasa helped her build a new structure, not a barn, but something smaller. A place for her carving tools. A place she could keep what was hers. He taught her to mix ash into soil for planting. "Even ruin feeds the next life," he said. They planted corn by the edge of the clearing. Eliza carved each night, now faster, now braver. Not just animals and women. She carved moments. The bell trap. The burning barn. A hawk in flight above a quiet man and a girl with her hand on his sleeve. She placed them in a row on the new shelf. On the first truly warm day, she walked to the windowsill and found a new feather there. Small. Brown at the tip. A hawk again. Or maybe something else. She picked it up, held it to her heart, then tucked it into her braid. Wakasa was chopping wood nearby. She called out. "When I'm grown," she said, "and someone asks who I was before, I'm going to tell them I was Ash once. But someone saw a light in me." He looked at her with the faintest smile. And she smiled back. Because the snow was gone. And they had stayed.